Welcome back, one and all, to The Information Revolution, a podcast for people who work with information. And we've been thinking about the future and thinking about the current state of play. And today we've decided that we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. And this will be the first in perhaps short series of discussions around basically what is the current state. And it's fair to say today might be reasonably negative. And then from there, we'll talk about some meaningful ways to actually change things or meaningful directions that we think we could be heading. So in terms of doing the usual intros, my name is Michael Upton, and I'm an information consultant and director of a little company in Wellington called Metataxis New Zealand.
Thanks, Michael. I'm Judi Vernau. I'm a director of that same little company in Wellington, and I'm an information architect.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra, but need to be clear, my views are my own.
Fantastic. Yeah. So this felt like a logical follow-on. Last time we got together, we were talking about skills for the future and so forth, and certainly all been party to some conversations and concerning how things are at the moment. And we thought, look, it'd be really negative to just dwell on problems that we have at the moment or issues the industry's facing. But we thought, well, let's clear the air and then we'll see how long this takes. And then ideally, from the next episode onwards, then we can talk about, how things could be different. So I'll kick things off. One thing that's been on my mind recently is that there's a lot of conversation around influence and around sort of some of the stuff that we really covered off in the people stuff around how you could shift the relationship that you have with your organization by basically being more influential, techniques like being able to tell stories, techniques about sort of putting yourself in the sort of your internal customers' shoes, having that kind of focus in your work so that you think about how can you help people in your business be organized. And while I really believe that, I also think that a real challenge at the moment is um, you might call it role fit. So it's all very well to say, yeah, I'm going to go and try and do those things. But actually, if you've been put in a box where your box is, I support a document management system, and therefore any conversation I have with you where I'm trying to help you work better, the result is that I'm going to suggest something to do with my document management system. You might be kind of hamstrung, really, and so I think one of the challenges that we face on a really practical level in terms of people trying to work better is that for a lot of us, there is a real awareness that the scope of information out there in the organization is much, much broader than a particular technology set. And a clash between that and the expectations from the business about what's our domain and what's the thing that we work on. Yeah. So I think that's a real concern because it is quite easy to kind of talk in a big way and a grand way about how things could be so much better and it could have so many exciting opportunities. But I think it raises, it basically creates a potential barrier to actually getting there. Yeah, and I think that's something that
I,
people
won-
feel.
I wonder how often you get a chance in information management even to have a conversation with senior leadership team or the CE or whoever it is about what are you actually expecting from my
Mm,
department? What do you think we're here for? What do you want us to be doing?
mm,
And I think that having it as a two-way conversation, like this is what I think we could offer. What do you think about that? I don't see that happening particularly. I mean, not that I have a huge experience in that area, but yeah, I don't see that conversation happening very often. I think it's more you're appointed into this position. There's a role spec, job description. So this
Yeah,
is what you're doing.
and it might be a bit of a
See
which is
what I
side
part of
mean?
point, but I don't think I would see that conversation in any reasonably large organization. That I don't think that conversation would ever hit the exec, but I think still,
Well,
to your
or yeah,
point, it's like, who further up the
yeah,
food chain would you have those conversations
sure.
with, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a natural consequence of bureaucratic organisations working a little bit like that. But I, as a bit of a symptom, I see records being tossed around in organisations, and what I mean by that is that it's one of those business units that's constantly moving
Yeah.
in lots of organisations.
Yeah,
And it's in IT, it's in corporate services, it's in something else, it's in something else. But it's kind of become this political football, and nobody really wants to own it because I don't think people really know what to do with it. And the one thing that's pretty consistent among about 98% of the organizations I work with is that it is nowhere near the CIO, the CEO, and it doesn't have that kind of level of visibility. And it's one of the reasons I'm really pleased that we're talking about this as a sort of foundational piece, because that honest self-appraisal is really important, I think, if we're going to rebuild this stuff. Um, just something that you were talking about there too, Michael. There's a guy named Chris Argyris who was one of these management scholars, sort of 40 years ago. But the thing he always used to talk about was the theory in action versus the theory in use. And it's a really simple way of thinking about, what people say they're going to do versus what they're actually going to do. And if I look at all of the organizations that, I work with and talk to, the thing that I see is continually see policy that says, every piece of information created or used by a public servant in the pursuance of their
yeah,
job is a record and must be kept. And then I go into an organization and, they've got 760 business systems and, 759 of them are non-compliant with all of the regulations that, the policy of the organization says information must be compliant with.
yeah,
And, I think that's a really, it's good, I think, that you started there because I think that's a really telling piece of the puzzle. And I think it would be okay if, there was if we'd taken a maturity approach to records and said that, compliance with this is nirvana and that's what we want to aim for. But you know what? We're still going to actively manage, these other 759 systems and look after and regulate the quality of the information that's in them. But records has kind of been frozen out of that conversation. And I think that's a real, I think that really says a lot about where our sort of star is in the organization. Because, those systems are considered, data systems. And partly that's because, records management have over various time periods tried to define those systems out as something that we don't have to manage because they don't have records in them because they don't really hold something that looks like an
looks like a
electronic
record.
version of a
Yeah,
of a of a physical document, and
yeah,
so therefore not a record.
Mm.
But now what it just means is that there's 759 systems in the organization. Well, there's a bunch of file servers, but there's probably 750 systems in the organization that are being operated and managed by data people. There's sort of 9 systems that IT have just ended up with because nobody else will have them. And, it's file servers and those sorts of things. And then there's one system that's sort of seen as the scope of records responsibility and a bunch of file servers that are sort of seen as records problem kind of.
yeah. I was just looking at some stats for a huge list of systems for an organization, and it actually was a listing that has data catalog. It said against each system whether it had a retention and disposal classes attached to it, and I think about 5% of them did. And that's not saying are they actually actioned. That's just saying it's possible, but is it being doing? So that's quite interesting. I also wanted to say, um, you mentioned the policy and what it says about compliance. And I think most information management policies that I've had anything to do with, they always start by saying how much the organization values its information. And it's a key asset, and we're going to do all these lovely things. We're going to feed it and water it and really generally look after it. But then what happens? I don't know. Something happens, and it's no longer the case. Yeah, I mean, so many. You must find this too, Michael. So many information policies say exactly those things about how important
It's
it
the
is.
preamble. It's the
And we
policy
must,
preamble.
yeah, exactly. We must really look after these things. And then you get your 759 systems that are all doing their own thing.
Yeah, I think there though there's an interesting. I think it's very easy for us, because we're in records to say, oh, those systems obviously represent the information that's not being looked after. But I think what they really represent is the information that's not being looked after by us. Because the
Yeah,
people that have come along and built those business systems,
yeah.
you
They're
know,
looking
they're
after them very well, I'm
they're looking
sure.
after them
Yeah.
very well, and they've built them to manage their work every day.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
they make their work form a really orderly queue. And you know what? If you go into those systems, you can figure out the context of the case or whatever whatever the individual subject item that you're looking at is. You can figure it out in about 5 seconds. And you go into the average record system, and if you can figure out, if you can go down to the transaction level and figure out what a transaction's actually about in less than 20 minutes, I mean, you're doing really well. Which I think there's something there that records really have to think about, because if we can only look after buckets that have documents in them, and if we keep talking about how context is everything and we've got to have amazing metadata for context, well, I mean, if I look at a business system, I kind of see a database, and then I see an interface that provides all of the business context, and I see a brilliant record system. But the other thing I see is that we're not managing any of them. And part of that's because, our compliance standards say that, well, it's not up to scratch. So obviously we can't touch it. When, I think it points to a general sort of lack of pragmatism among, it's a regulatory problem, among records regulators. I think it points to a general lack of pragmatism about just how we do what we're there to do. That's really hurting us.
I think now that you mentioned the regulator thing, if we're talking about the current state of play, I think um, there's real challenges regarding role, scope, and purpose that extend all the way to the regulator. And so what's the regulator and able to regulate practically, and what relationships do they have across their jurisdiction, and what do they see their role as being? And yeah, I swing in this wild pendulum. I'll say this stuff out loud. Having worked for our local regulator, and so many people who I really enjoy working with and respect in there. That when I try and think about what's the point, what's the scope of what these people do, if you put aside the whole archival management aspect, you go, well, what else is there? I vacillate between, they should be leading the charge as a kind of a government CIO that really actually means information, rather than just CTO, which is usually the de facto for what a CIO does. Um, and on the other hand, go, well, maybe they should just stay the hell out. Maybe being slightly facetious, but maybe the focus ought to be on what is going to be of intergenerational value for that jurisdiction, for its people. And maybe as a regulator, they can step back from all this other stuff that I think clouds people's days. Yeah, I find it so frustrating when I talk with professionals who are really trying to achieve things, but are saying, "Oh, I can't do this because of some specific thing with the regulator," and I know that you know,
The regulator won't turn up to enforce it.
yes, and in most jurisdictions and most so it's not just a jurisdictional thing, but in most lines of work, people aren't waiting on a regulator before they act. Like simple as that. People aren't going, why don't I, you know, I can see this opportunity that I could jump on and do something with. You know, shall I wait for the regulator to tell me that I can do it? you know,
Yeah.
and but it's just quickly just to bring it back to that kind of concept of role or whatever. I see this thing where people naturally go, all right, well, I exist to basically deliver the services within a scope that is defined by the
Mm.
regulation, or the regulator, or the environment, as opposed to um, particularly, in New Zealand, basically no one's called records anymore. We're all information management, and it's like, well, so if that was a meaningful shift, then why are we still just hanging on the Public
Yeah,
Records
why aren't
Act
we saying
says?
here's the 2% of my role that is the regulation, and here's the 98%
Yeah,
of my role that's all
yeah,
about the quality of information that
yeah,
my organisation
absolutely.
Mm.
Like,
produces and uses.
what are the information sources people need to achieve their work, and what quality should that have? And oh, these aren't records, or they're not our records. Well, I don't mind, because my job isn't just to think about management of my own organisation's records. Yeah,
I think I think there's a queue there for everybody in records, and the challenge of every archival jurisdiction that across Australia and New Zealand, at least that I've spoken to, is that the head of those organisations is always a political appointee, and basically what they can do in their role is determined by a type of social license. And I think we can look at the amount of enforcement activity that they do, and we can get to one of 2 points from that amount of enforcement activity. And one is that they don't have the political cover to do any enforcement activity, because none of them do any enforcement activity. It's a little bit, it was a little bit New Zealand that was looking promising for a little while, that now isn't. But either none of them have the political cover to actually go into an agency and do enforcement work, or they just actually don't want to, because they aren't doing it and haven't doing it. And you know what? I've looked at through annual reports, and I have never ever seen revenue from fines or anything like that. What I see is a whole bunch of we prefer to advise. And I was talking to someone from one of the regulators um, recently, and we were talking about regulatory overreach. And what I actually think we've got is, I think we've got cultural institutions that their job is to get the 0.1% of records that are of long-term enduring historical value to the state
mm,
out the other end of the agencies that they regulate. And I think that's happening, and I think they're pretty happy with it. And I think I sort of almost don't know how to finish that thought bubble, but I think there's a bit of regulatory overreach going on there. And look, I got agreement from this person about it as well. And I think I think they're sort of frustrated by that as well. But I think the basic problem is that, they're trying to regulate 100% of everything. They care about 0.1% of everything, but the records profession kind of moves on as though we are here to faithfully implement and faithfully enforce, this regulation.
yeah,
But we never get any cover for it. It's not like it is in Australia, where, you know, if the archives were acting like, Austrac, one of the the counterterrorism, anti-money laundering regulator is here, that keeps handing out fines of, a billion and a bit, to one bank, and $750 million to another bank. And, we would never ever have a problem with records, you know, being kept in the way they're supposed to be. But it's just not happening. And I can't see it ever happening, because that role is a political appointee. And
I think well, if I'm going to have a go at finishing your thoughts
please,
for you,
someone finish my thought for me.
Yeah.
um, I mean, what I'd say is that, like, we could easily continue having a conversation about regulation and all of that stuff. And for me, what I would hope for most from kind of people working with information, whatever your title, is that this becomes a side conversation, a side issue. It's not important to you doing
Yeah.
your job. It's not important to conversations within the profession about how we could do good work, because you know there are key outcomes. There are things we're trying to achieve. There's you know
As a
there's certainly this aspect of kind of basically being able to hold government to account, a bunch of the stuff that part of the legislative purpose. Um, and we can keep all that stuff in our heads, or in our hearts, like in terms of how we think about how to deliver services. But ultimately, I don't think we can go chasing. Um, Basically, I think it's sorry, I'm going to get too sort of
no,
philosophical on it, but but it's just that classic story about what can you control, right? Like what's within your control. And I can't
Yeah.
control legislation. I can't control the regulator. I can't,
Yeah.
it's
Yep.
it's not for me to
Yeah.
sit
Yeah.
around or,
No,
and
and we're
sorry, I'm
clearly
being overly negative by saying just sit around,
go
but
for it.
but basically, perhaps it's the opposite of sitting around. Perhaps it's invest all my effort in trying to make something change over in that regulatory space. Whereas I just think, you know,
The
noted,
regulation
and move on.
regulation just made us obsessed with getting everything and putting it in this one bucket. And our organisations have
Yeah,
overwhelmingly told us that that's not what they want.
yeah.
And I think those two things are at conflict. And I think the way the budget's going for records management generally, it just says that that's not what that's not what organisations want. And if we aren't giving organisations what they want, our budgets are going to keep on going down. And as you say, Michael, there was somebody reached out to me a couple of weeks ago via LinkedIn to say, I think I mentioned it on one of the other podcasts, but basically to say that they'd just taken over records because the whole records team was now gone. And this person's title was data manager. And he was saying, "Oh, I've never, I'm following your blog and listening to your podcasts now because I've never managed records before." But he's going to come in. His title's data management, and he's going to treat 98% of his job as making the organisation better, and 2% of it as complying with my records obligations.
Mm-mm.
And that's a place that we're never going to see a records manager in that place ever again. I don't think,
Interesting.
because it's gone. The organization has basically said, we don't want this value proposition, the value proposition that records has. And, and it was a real, just on, on that same topic, I was at a Rimper event last week, and there was a discussion towards the end about records and basically should we ditch records as a label, because this person was saying that
Well,
every
you
time
should.
they were
You
saying
should.
every time they say, oh, I'm in records, somebody either thinks that they have vinyl, or
Yeah, yeah.
or they get extremely bored very quickly and don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that's a catastrophe, because I think the history of records management is one of how organizations, express strategic power, and how governments express strategic power by showing consistency over the long term. And I don't think we're seeing that. And I think you can directly tie it back to, regulation and trying to faithfully implement that regulation. I think it's had the opposite of the effect it should. And
Sure.
it's really taken us away from the quality of the stuff. You know, most people love structured data. They absolutely love business systems because it just makes their job easy. And, we're kind of stuck with documents because, well, you can't put structured data in a system that complies with regulation. And so, yeah, it just becomes this, sort of snake eating its tail vicious cycle where,
Uh, an interesting thing, to me about what you're saying, Carl, is that when we were talking about skills for the future, and I was saying that I thought actually basically interface design of information systems ought to be part of what we're skilling ourselves up to do. And the reason that I think that is because, as you say, line of business systems manage records better than when you're having to faff around with the analog to paper documents, except in a system. There will always be lines of business, like in government, working with policy and la la la, that are much less, um, procedural, I suppose, or you're not doing a repeating at scale. You're doing weird stuff every day, and it'll just
yeah,
be.
and what you want to know is ultimately, has something been drafted? Has it been approved? And has it been,
If
is it the
if
most current? Because that's actually, it's actually really valuable. There are lots of places where those principles are really valuable, but not 98% of the places that we work with.
Yeah. But the irony is, that that, uh, you said about sort of being too focused, or not too focused, but very focused on context and rich metadata and stuff. That is what line of business systems do, right? That is
Yes,
what they're all
yes.
about, is basically establishing structured metadata. But is that metadata written around or designed around compliance? No, because normally if it's done well, then someone actually thought through the information architecture from a perspective
Hopefully.
other than just compliance.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah. And does it also mean that actually the retention disposal schedules need to be completely rewritten to focus on the very, very important stuff rather than all the stuff, if you see what I
Yeah,
mean?
I don't
I mean,
know.
So
obviously, it's really tricky at the moment um, to be able to sort out what needs to be kept and what isn't when you've got billions of electronic records. But just and if you're trying to do that automatically, it's very, very hard, as I have experienced, to be sure that you can automatically classify things correctly. And the current, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but certainly in New Zealand, the General Disposal Authority really doesn't support automatic classification very well at all. So should it all just be much simpler in that respect, so that we really can focus on that 5% that actually needs to be kept?
I heard someone
Yeah,
say, I heard
sorry,
someone
Michael.
say at an event relatively recently, like just floating the idea out there that perhaps there could basically be statements of risk around retention, which I think would scare the heck out of a whole lot of people who are used to the idea of I apply
Yeah,
rules, because it's basically saying, I
sure.
mean, and risk could be flipped on its head as value as well, right? So you could basically say, look, this is what's important, these kinds of things, and lots of places would issue statements about what constitutes a good public archive, or what are your assessment criteria for that, and you could just leave it there and go, over to you.
I mean,
But I think,
National Archives in Australia are kind of leaning that way.
mm,
They've established, 3 designations of records now, and, I forget the name
Mm,
of the bottom 2, but the first one is
right.
the core records of the agency. And, they need to be managed compliantly in compliant systems. And then, it's sort of risk-based approaches to the rest, if I remember the standard correctly. So,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
that is sort of appearing. And I mean, I think there is an understanding that is the reality of what's going on anyway.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and I think I'm to my point about kind of hoping that the regulatory environment can be put aside. I kind of think, you know,
So then we talk about
yeah, I
it.
was going
Yeah,
to
And then
say
we
right.
talk
we could
about
have we
it.
could
It's
go on
kind
and
of
on
hard,
and
isn't it?
on about how things could be
Magnetic.
different there, but I think also I would just encourage people to go, but they're not, and what am I going to do, and not
Mm.
let
Yeah,
that hold you
yeah,
back. Judy, I'm
yeah.
interested in your thinking around what you see around sort of architecture and the structuring of information and things. I mean, auto classification and challenges with that. Obviously, that's one part of that, but I'm sure you've got other thoughts.
Just in terms of challenges around structuring, and I think certainly here there's the organisations who are putting in new systems are realising that they need to put more thought into the information architecture. But how that actually manifests itself is another question. I think there's a growing understanding that you can't just put in whatever the system is in terms of a EDRMS or however content management system, whatever we want to call this repository. Um, there's a growing understanding that it needs some thought, but that doesn't need to mean to say that it's done particularly well still.
Mm,
I mean, I've certainly seen a couple of organizations, well, probably more than a couple of, you know, build an information architecture and then implement it either not at all or very badly, which then causes even more problems because the users are just going to really get pissed off about that, if I can say
mm,
so. Especially when, I mean, I can think of one particular instance where the users were absolutely really engaged in the whole process of a new system and really enthusiastic and all for it. But the IA was really compressed down to not very much at all, so that the outcome was not good because it's going to cost too much.
oh, really? So it still costs.
Yeah, and I think a lack of understanding of what it really means from the techie people, from the IT guys. What what does that really mean? How are people going to use this? Well, it's just technology, and the technology does this, 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 and this, so that's fine. And interestingly, I asked my colleagues in Metataxis UK what they're finding around uh, things that are not going well, or unhappinesses, or whatever, or just the experience of um, users in the UK. And they said the last point, there's a whole, they really got into this, by the way, and
Yeah,
gave
good
me
on them.
a bundle of stuff.
Yeah.
But a really interesting point I thought at the end was, it says, our experience of Microsoft 365 functionality is moving well ahead of user requirements and abilities. There's a lot more we can do in 365, but our users are still in the business of just building the containers for their documents. They're really not taking proper advantage. They're a long way from exploiting what 365 can do for them, or realizing the benefits. So they say we're forever building foundations and not doing the cool stuff, which is interesting. It's an interesting point. My small experience around this over here is that some of the cool stuff does get put in, but not governed properly.
Mm.
So you're absolutely back to looking in so many different places. I'm currently struggling with that a bit with a client, knowing where to find stuff in all the different places it could be. They also say users are finding it extremely difficult to make the mental shift from folder paradigm to making more use of metadata. So, same old, really. And
I
that's,
One that
that is really hard. They say it's a massive issue.
What I'd say about
And
that
also,
specifically
yeah,
is
yeah,
I see that when you're still working with documents, and so that's where I come back and keep banging on about that concept of basically building a line of business system for almost any line of business, is that when people are basically guided through a process by the interface of a system, the idea that at some point you attach a document is no stress, no stretch, and the rest of the
yeah,
process has been about capturing and updating metadata, and it's just not framed at all in the sense of
yeah,
the kind of horrors of
there's an
having an
interface.
EDRMS where you have 15 fields. It's
yeah.
not that. It's process
No,
But
driven.
there's an interface, and I'm going to put this piece of metadata in here because you know what? In 3 weeks' time, I'm going to come back to this case I'm working on,
Mm.
and I'm going to need to refer to that metadata to remember where I was up to.
Yep.
And
And I've
yeah,
done it
for
before,
then,
example,
and I remember that it was
yeah,
useful last time. Yeah.
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And I think that's
yeah. I
a
think I
challenge for us.
think I think if you can make your metadata as absolutely tied to what the users really need, obviously, I mean, obviously, but I think that's
I
not
think
always
it's,
done.
but I think
Really
need.
understanding what they need, and they'll tell you that actually it would be really useful to have this, this, and this, because that's how they want to look for stuff. And then you can organize around, well, how can we help this to get attributed to the content automatically,
I think
so
we've got
that
to go.
you have to do very little?
I think we've got to go beyond need though, because
Oh, go beyond need,
when
right?
we talk about need, we kind of say think about it as though what do people need to move forward, or sorry, what do people need to find something, or what are the things that you'll need to find something, and people rattle off a list of 14 different things, and then they prove to us that they don't need any of that stuff by going to the whatever structure they're currently whatever bucket of documents they're currently keeping in, and
Yeah,
finding things just fine without any of that stuff.
Mhm.
And I think
yeah,
I
it
think we've
needs
got
to
to
be
distinguish
tested.
between, and I think it has to be more
I
than
agree with that.
the need, the way we sort of contextualize need. I think it
Yeah.
needs to be, now I can't stop using the word. But it has to be that thing that they cannot move forward without.
Right.
So it's that thing where, or that thing that's going to save them a lot of time. So, if they've got a
Yeah.
business process they need to move forward, well, they either need to, you know, read through the 14 documents that they've attached to this thing to figure out where it's up to, or they can just go to the little button at the top that tells them what stage the process is at, and then they don't have to think about it because they've got the little bit of metadata they've
Yeah.
populated at the top that,
Yep.
I think it needs to be. I think it has to be that
But
kind of thing.
So, to generalize from what you're saying, Carl, because I 100% agree with that. Sounds like we both do that. The Another thing that I think is an issue in the state of play at the moment is that many of us are really unsophisticated when it comes to actually understanding the business. So we say these big words about needing to understand the business, but if you go out there and go, "Can you tell me what you need?" and I'll turn it into a list of metadata for you, then that's probably rubbish. But if we develop those, I'm basically talking about like customer design kind of, design experience, whatever, those kinds of
yeah,
words, those kind of skills. Again, coming back yet again to the idea that perhaps some business analysis type techniques need to be in
absolutely.
Yeah.
the
Do we
toolkit.
understand the business?
Yeah,
Do we
Yeah,
actually understand the business at the process level? What's the process these people are doing every day?
yeah.
How do they
absolutely.
execute it?
And
And
you
very
can't do the
pragmatically, if I'm going to go and talk to some people who are, in order to deliver something for them or to understand what they're doing, can I do that in a way more sophisticated way than having a checklist of questions that don't actually get the
Oh god,
answers,
yeah. Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's like all
yeah.
that stuff like, can I observe what you're doing? Um, if I deleted these documents, what would you do next? Those kinds of things that
Mm,
elicit answers from people in a meaningful way rather than
mm.
saying, what do you need? When people just make stuff
Absolutely.
up about should rather than reality.
Can you bring some core documents to our meeting? Can you
Yeah, yeah,
explain to me how you use them?
yeah.
Can you explain to me what they're related to?
Mm,
All of that kind of, how
yeah.
you would work through this. What's the process?
If I threw these documents out, what would happen tomorrow? I like
Well,
questions like
that's
that.
I've never asked that
I love
question
it. I
actually, but
love
it
it.
is a good question. It is a good
If you
question.
couldn't access this information, what would you do
Yeah.
next? And people go, oh, well, I'd just go back to the website to get it. It's like, oh, so it's just public. Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. You know,
Oh,
What does
those
this
yes.
what
kinds
does
of
this
things.
tell us about what does this tell us about the state of play in records? Because I think we're talking about things that are challenges, but I'm I'm unclear about how we generalize this to, the state of play in records at the moment and what it means for the industry and how we proceed.
Fair enough. I think,
What's the general overarching point?
well, I'm going to go back to where I
Is it
started, which is about that idea of role fit and about basically, I'm sure that we could have a future conversation about, that. And I think
Yeah,
I think fundamentally that's one of the things that we've yet to cover in this podcast when we think about all the other stuff about, telling good stories and about, you know, being meaningful stuff. I think one of the challenges that is a kind of concrete or a blocker to shifting the state of play is just the idea that people feel stuck in a role that wouldn't actually allow them to do
we
the things that we're all saying, oh, well, why don't you just start doing this? Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree
Mm,
completely. I think we're playing a role that our organizations don't value, and I think I read a blog post about this recently. So they're telling us that they don't value it by continually reducing our funding and ignoring us, and putting us further and further down in the organization. And I think we're going to start reading between those lines, and we're going to figure out a way to break out of that role
yeah.
that we're in.
That's the $65,000 question, isn't it? How do we
$65
make that
million.
change?
It's like just.
Well, yeah, yeah.
But I mean, I think that's the really meaningful conversation for us over the next. And I
Yeah.
think that's what I think. I mean, I think as an overarching thing, I think it's partly what we've been aiming at with the whole time we've been talking. 10 or 11, however many episodes
I
we've got
guess you're
today.
right.
For sure, for sure. And I
Yeah.
think I guess part of this is that thing that I think we've had really great conversations around sort of specific techniques and things that you can deploy, and encourage everyone to go and have a listen and see whether you agree. Um, and sometimes you still just bang up against this point where it's like, yeah, well, I'd love to do those things, but it's just not my job.
Mm.
So yeah, great. I reckon in terms of where we're at today, that might be enough focusing on kind of the doom and gloom of.
Have we been negative enough for you, Michael?
I look, I don't actually feel like this was that negative.
No, it
I don't
wasn't.
think
It
we
wasn't.
I don't know.
because I don't I just don't think we're those people.
No.
But I think it certainly set some of the foundation for And I mean, I think if we just look at if everybody looking at greed, that they don't have the kind of budget they have they'd like to manage the problems at the scale that they'd like to. I mean, I think that's a good signal to everybody in records that our organizations have a lot more things that they value a lot more, and they're funding those things, and they're not funding us. And until we can break out of that, things are going to be a bit dire.
Right. So in terms of the kinds of things that we've been, that three of us talked about before this episode, we are thinking about coming back to that idea of role, thinking about the idea of developing positive cycles that the opposite of a vicious circle,
Yeah,
in
the
terms of
virtuous
our work
cycle.
life. Um, I think we'll try and hit some real specifics about some things that you could do differently right now, rather than just sort of dreaming of a glorious future. And we've definitely been talking about the idea of making a good system, like what does that actually take, and then what does that mean for our work. So just putting that out there as some ideas. Anyone listening to this, if you have other things that you want to cover off, or you want us to tackle on any of those topics, then please do let us know. Otherwise, thanks, Karl, thanks, Judi, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
See you next time.